Hi, it's Jeff Bloomfield, founder and CEO of BrainTrust. And today we're going to be talking about a practical strategy that's going to help you connect to your people's purpose and vision that will allow you to get maximum performance out of them, even in the face of a recession. We're also going to talk about the latest in neuroscience research that'll help you all but eliminate change resistance inside your culture today. And we might even talk about a little bit about how you can identify those lions that you can pull out of that culture of sheep that you might be having to lead today as well. We're going to talk about that and a lot more on today's episode. We'll see you there.
Welcome back to part two of our delicious conversation with Jeff Bloomfield. Jeff Bloomfield is the founder and CEO of BrainTrust. He's the best-selling business author of NeuroSelling and Story-Based Selling. He specializes in taking the science of decision-making and leveraging it to help people be more effective and impactful in their conversations and communications. Very powerful for us as leaders. And he has been featured in Sales and Marketing magazine as well as Forbes. He speaks on stages around the world. He has been really giving us some really powerful information. Just, by the way, if you didn't catch part one, go back. There's such enormous value in part one. And, you know, we talked about everything from how his grandfather impacted him. And you might go, well, who cares? Listen, go back, listen. It will blow your mind how this Kentucky gentleman moved to Ohio to start a farm with a vision of how that would impact his grandson, who is Jeff, and what that has done and how it's impacted Jeff and what it's done there, and see if you can see yourself in that story, because I guarantee you will. We talked about creating the ripple effect. You know, you've heard me speak about this many times, and Jeff used exactly the same analogy, that when you drop the rock in the pond, there is a ripple that is beyond the rock. Every twig on that pond is lifted. And that is what it's all about for us. It's about understanding that. Jeff also walked us through a very powerful strategy, very simple. Don't get me wrong, very simple strategy that you can do by taking an hour with your team that will up-level your productivity, up-level your effectiveness, up-level the effectiveness and efficiency of your team. He'll do all those things and create a bond that you'd never even considered before. So that was all in part one, and there was so much more. That was just one part of it. So much more. We're going to dive into part two. And so as we dive into part two, as I said, the name of Jeff's book is called NeuroSelling. But let's sort of burst the bubble here, because you might be thinking, okay, well, I'm not in the sales business. First of all, you are, because we all are. If you're trying to get your kids to go to bed at night or do their homework, that's selling. But let's just take it out of that context for a minute. That this is not just about selling. This is about using neuroscience to really lead and bond people to you. So let's jump in there, Jeff. Let's start with, as a leader, someone listening, viewing the show, maybe they've just jumped in at part two and they go, okay, neuroselling, don't know if that's for me. Talk to us about why this is so important.
Yeah, I think if you think about what makes a person successful in life, period, whether it's personally or professionally, it doesn't matter whether they're young, whether they're old. It really is the ability to communicate effectively and how that communication impacts relationships. Well, if that's the case, and I believe it'd be hard to argue against it,
yes,
then we probably ought to stop for a second and say, well, then how do we study the effectiveness of communication and more importantly, the ineffectiveness of communication?
Yes.
Well, where do we begin? Well, for me, it begins between the ears, because it's the brain in neuroscience, from biology to physiology to psychology. When you start to put those three studies together, they really do determine what comes out of your mouth. And so if you really want to impact becoming an effective communicator, you start to think about, well, I have to become a student of the brain, because the brain is the engine that drives communication. Right. And that's why, to me, I was always so fascinated with neuroscience and with behavioral psychology. It wasn't to nerd out with people about how much I know about the brain. It really was the application.
Tell the truth. It was.
Right? Yeah. Well, okay. Well, yeah, maybe just a little bit.
A little bit, right?
Yeah. It maybe didn't start out that way, but because I have competition as one of my 5 strength finders, then I wanted to be the best at it, right? So
of course,
but it really does come down to that: is how do we help people understand? We don't need to turn people into neuroscientists or behavioral psychologists.
no.
What we need to do is give them just enough simplicity, the old farm boy simplicity, to understand what's going on between the ears. So in any given situation, they can quickly identify what they typically would leave in the unconscious to conscious, so they can do something about it in the moment to positively impact that relationship that they're interacting in the moment.
So let's sort of dive into a little bit of that, because you brought up an important subject. It's my subject around the emotional source code, which is that so much of what people are doing is 99.9% unconscious. They don't even know it's unconscious. One of the quotes I use all the time is that most people have never made a decision in their life. They've made a reaction that they've called a decision, but it's actually history just repeating itself. And when we are stressed, under psychology says under stress we regress. So when we're stressed, and by the way, there's 2 kinds of stress: there's positive stress and negative stress. But so you can become incredibly stressed in a quote positive situation. You win the lottery, woo, it's very exciting, and then there's like massive amount of stress with that. Like, oh my God, are people going to come and ask me for money? And how do I deal with my aunt who I've not spoken to in 20 years? That's stress. And then there's the stress of, for instance, a downturn in the market. So there becomes a very easy look at someone else and see what they're doing. And we live in the look at someone else world, because we live in these social media bubbles where you're being fed what you already believe. You've got all kinds of cognitive bias coming at you every single day, and you're surrounding yourself. I've often said the worst advice you ever got was surround yourself with like-minded people. That's terrible advice. Surround yourself with people who disagree with you. I had a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday. He's a friend of mine. I love him to bits. He loves Donald Trump. I don't. I think Donald Trump's terrible as a human being. I'm not talking about politics, as a human being, but he thinks he's the best thing. That doesn't mean I can't get along with him. In fact, I can learn things from him and he can learn things from me, and we do. And part of our banter is that, and that's good. It's not for or against. It's like, can we grow? But we're living in this world where people are not doing that. And they're tending to jump on this bandwagon and sheeple thinking. Walk us through a little bit about understanding that, even at a neuroscience level, and what we can do because as leaders, we're dealing with people who are in those bubbles. They're extreme left, they're extreme right. There's not much left in the middle, sadly.
You're absolutely right. And there's extreme left, extreme right. And then you got the generational differences that are happening as well on top of it. And one of the things that I watch this sometimes, and I shake my head, and other times I want to shove pencils in my eyes. When I look at our culture today, and because I know what's happening, and the science behind this, and we talked about this in episode 1 was, part 1 was the idea of self-preservation orientation, that the brain is looking for safety first. Well, there's elements that go into that are just biology. And so when the brain scans its environment and it sees something that's different than it perceives itself as, it automatically needs to identify that as a threat until it's identified as not a threat.
Yeah, it's a threat first. Get that. It's a threat first.
That's just how we're wired, right? Because we just have safety first always. So now I want you to think about this in terms of both physical attributes and then emotional attributes. So if I look and scan my environment and I see an entire race of people who look nothing like me, my instinct is that they're a threat. Mm-hmm. And then when my media and my politics and my government keep telling me they're a threat, it'll subconsciously reinforce that that's a threat. And therefore now we have all kinds of different racism. Now everybody's a racist. No, you have to understand what's happening. Part of it is biology when it's not true, because you've learned how to overcome the fact that someone looks differently than me. I can communicate with them, and actually they're really much like me, because I've identified on the emotional side of things that they're human. They have the same dreams and the same wants and the same fears I have. Therefore, we're connected. It doesn't matter what we look like. But when you're being barraged with information that says an entire group of people are out to get you, subconsciously, you're just soaking that information in all day, and it's reinforcing a negative belief that's actually not true.
Right.
And so that's part of the sheeple effect. So what happens is we tend to then gravitate toward those megaphones that we feel like are protecting us, because they're shouting out the things that we believe.
Yes.
Notice I said we believe.
Yes.
And that's what happens in the sheep effect is, well, if I'm in a large enough herd of people that look just like me and think just like me and act just like me, I'll be safer. And it's all driven by government. It's all driven by social media. And it's all driven by the people and the power brokers in place that want to communicate in this way to control and manipulate a population. So it is what it is, and there's no way you refute it. It's both science and psychology.
Right. So now, in your skill set around communication, which is your skill set, and by the way, I want everybody to understand this, that, you know, you've heard me say this before, that great leaders are not always great communicators are not always great leaders. But great leaders are always great communicators. So putting this in the context of communication, because it's you just said it. I mean, we are surrounded by manipulation. How do we communicate better? I mean, let's just put it at that simple level. How do we communicate better with our people in a way that is not about manipulation, but is about empowering?
Yeah, and I'll use this term, we say it a lot around here, is being a great communicator isn't about manipulation, it's about modulation. And what I mean by that is you have direct impact over the neurochemistry of the people that you communicate with based on how you communicate with them. And let me expound on that a little bit. And we talked earlier a little bit about some of the neurochemistry from, cortisol, adrenaline, and then you got oxytocin and dopamine and serotonin, all these things that are happening. They're happening at an unconscious level, right? Your body's physiological response to what it's receiving and the inputs it's taking in. Well, as a communicator, what we've learned over the years, especially the last 20, looking at work, the Kahneman and Tversky done a lot of work in behavioral economics, and Tony Jack doing the analytical versus the emotional empathic network with Goleman and emotional intelligence. Here's what we know, that in the analytical network and then the emotional empathic network, and I'm going to oversimplify for understanding purposes. And by the way, just a side note, if you run across people who tell you that they are an expert in neuroscience, you should probably run from them, because we can only be modestly knowledgeable in a field of, that's like saying I understand the deep understandings of the universe. When someone says I'm an expert in neuroscience, you can be smarter than when you're being chased in the woods by a bear, you don't have to be the fastest person, you should be faster than one other person. Neuroscience is evolving so quickly, but the technology has at least allowed us to peer into what's happening in the brain that's a little more consistent across socioeconomic backgrounds, gender, all of those things. And so what happens is the analytical network, or your neocortex, processes all the facts and the figures. It's your evaluation, comparison, analysis, all of that. And then in your emotional empathic center of your brain, that's where the limbic system, and a lot of the areas of the reptilian part of the brain, the amygdala, hippocampal area, that area is where you process all of your emotions and bring in meaning and internal visualization, external visualizations happening at the neocortex level. So I'll stop nerding out for a second and make the point. So if I communicate with your analytical network, by biological nature, I've suppressed your emotional empathic network, and I cause you to go into evaluation, comparison, analysis standpoint, and it's probably more than likely going to spike the wrong kind of neurochemistry. Yes. With cortisol, adrenaline, those things that are kind of hyping me up to figure out if I'm in danger, if I'm evaluating this correctly. Does it align with my beliefs? Do I actually think I understand what you're talking about? So as a leader, it's important that you understand how to tap into the emotional empathic network first, because the order matters. And yes, it goes back to, Cynic simplified it with the why, how, what. But the reality is most leaders communicate outside in. We communicate what we know, and it turns out to be more information, which causes me to activate my analytical network, which does not make me trust you. It actually, I can't. It's a different part of the brain. So what we tell leaders is you've got to learn how to communicate with what we call the emotion coaster. You have to be able to tap into the emotional empathic network of your people, whether it's a one-on-one or a one-on 50. And then when you want them to evaluate and compare something, then you can activate that analytical network. But then you better pretty quickly bring it back down into that emotional empathic network. And if you can ride that coaster that way as a communicator on purpose, you'll see everybody leaning in, because they connect with you emotionally, and then they understand you analytically, and then they have the meaning back to the emotional part of it, and then they can compare it analytically. And if you can keep doing that as a leader, you're not manipulating, you're modulating. And that's exactly how the brain wants to process that information in a trusted environment, if that makes sense.
So that's actually really good and really powerful for people to understand. And I know the book lays that out for people so they can understand that.
Yeah.
But this key is that I think what Jeff's just laid out beautifully for you to understand is that most of us start in a very logical, rational manner. And let's face it, I understand as a leader, you've been told you have to be logical, you have to be rational. You've probably been trained that way, particularly if you're over 45. So you've been trained to suppress, and therefore you're going to communicate in that way that's very rational, logical, and this makes sense, right? No, but yeah, I'll say yes because you write the paycheck. And so now you've got the wrong communication, and eventually somebody gets pissed off. Now you've got emotions, and you've got the wrong emotions. And this practicality that Jeff just gave you that is so incredibly valuable is it has to start at an emotional level. You then can go to the rational, back to the emotional, back to the rational, and this understanding of that is the modulation, that it can't all be emotional, but it can't all be logical.
Right.
You actually have to create this backwards and forwards for people to feel like, and this is really important. I've often said that what's the worst thing you can do to somebody? And I gave a keynote to the New York and NSA, National Speakers Association. And I said, put your hand up if at the end of a presentation, somebody has come up to you and said, wow, you're really smart. And everybody put their hand up, and I go, that's an insult.
Yes.
And they're like, what? What they're actually saying to you is, you used big words that I didn't understand, and I felt stupid. That's what they're actually telling you. And nobody is going to buy from somebody who makes them feel stupid. Don't make people feel stupid. Now, do you want to feel smart? You as the speaker? Of course you do. We all do. We've all got an ego, of course. But what Jeff is explaining to you is this key is in allowing people to feel smart by doing this modulation between the emotional and the rational and the emotional. So at the end of it, they go, I get it. I get it. And now I want to go and communicate that to somebody else. And that's what you were saying about disseminating the information that I think is really, really important. So again, thank you for that, because it's really powerful.
Well, let me add one thing to that. We use a phrase around here that I think is so important for leaders. It's about self-discovery, which leads to co-creation. Self-discovery, co-creation. You're like, well, what does that mean? What it means is I need to communicate in a way to where my people feel like they've discovered the information, and from an understanding standpoint, like they've discovered, I haven't forced it on them. They've discovered it. And therefore they are invested in co-creating the next step, the action step, the solution, whatever that might be. The minute I've connected those two dots, not only have I followed that emotion coaster, I've got such investment and buy-in because the other human being that I communicated with feels smart because they understand, and they feel invested because they've been asked to help co-create the next step, not being told what to do. It's such a powerful communication tool.
It really is. Really is. As I think about this, I want to talk about something that comes up for a lot of leaders, which is, and particularly even certainly in my own work, is that people cling to beliefs. And I understand that from a neuroscience point of view. They cling to beliefs. And beliefs are, in many ways, a primary driver. Let's talk about beliefs and how they play out as behaviors. And because one of like the question that has run my life, this is my question since I was 9 years old, which is, why do people do what they do, even when what they do doesn't make sense? Right. And part of the answer to that is beliefs. But let's address beliefs into behaviors from your point of view, from this understand, because the key thing you keep putting forward is really important, is we've got to be better communicators. But sometimes you're communicating with somebody with a belief system that is a bloody brick wall.
Yeah, no, it's such an important part of what we're getting into, Dov. I encourage leaders to do. If you don't have time to stop every week, put it on your calendar and just think, like pause, feel, think, process, brainstorm, like think about big ideas, think about big things. If you don't have time to stop and do that, you're going to stay on the hamster wheel. And what made me think of to say that, Dov, was this idea of beliefs leading to behaviors. There's these really deep core beliefs that could be, religion, faith, politics, whatever it is, or you're just core element. In general, though, from an application standpoint, there's a lot of beliefs. I shared in episode 1 my story of growing up on the farm, and some of my beliefs I learned from my papa: hard work and perseverance. Yep. That's a belief. I have this belief inside of me that I will outwork anyone because that's what I was trained to do. I learned to believe at a young age that hard work leads to success.
Right.
Now, is that the fastest way to success or the best way? Maybe not, probably not. But I will tell you that when I recognize that belief in others, and I've got some folks on my team that work themselves to the bone, and I have to stop them sometimes and say, hey, you're not following our core belief at a company of downtime and relaxation and balance. So sometimes a belief can be a positive attribute in its manifestation of a behavior because you work hard. But that same belief can also become, now I'm divorced 3 times because I'm a workaholic, and that belief of hard work and perseverance. Well, here's the question I have. Once you've identified some of those beliefs, what's the end goal for the behavior? Like what do you hope to accomplish? Because if the belief isn't actually leading you down the path to purpose, that's when you should probably stop and take pause in, is it a belief that was centered off of something that I learned as a young child that I grew up with, and now it's ingrained in me? Or is it a belief that's centered around the service of others that's leading to my purpose in how I behave every day? And just to pause on that, if I believe that the platinum rule from my papa, right? You treat other people better than they expect to be treated. If I say that's a belief of mine, it's how you treat people matters. But then as a leader, I never have that conversation where I pause and say, I want to really truly understand your personal vision. Then I don't demonstrate that belief. I'm really not actually, it's an espoused belief, but it's not enacted. And so I think it's so important to recognize that beliefs do tend to lead to behaviors. Doesn't mean it's the right behaviors. And the intensity of a belief tends to lead to the consistency of a behavior. Again, maybe not the right behavior because it might not be rooted in the right belief, but that tends to be a pattern that we see a lot in humans, but particularly in leaders.
And that's something for everybody to just consider for a moment, is if you just examine that, okay, your behaviors are a result of your beliefs. And the more deeply embedded the belief is, the more urgent the behavior will be that will follow that. That's not the question. The question is it taking you in the direction you want to go? If you're committed to, you have this belief that, you really want to, you have a vision, you're going to California and you live in Seattle, but you're committed to getting there, but you're headed north, you're going in the wrong direction. The belief is that California is north, and your vision is to get to California, you will get there eventually, but it will be a very, very much longer journey and a much more painful journey. And so, again, this idea, it's a very common one around hard work, particularly for people like us who grew up more, in a less affluent environment, is, hard work will get you there. And there's a really good friend of mine taught me years ago, and he said, do you know anybody who works harder than a Mexican gardener? This was his analogy to me. And I said, well, I don't have many Mexican gardeners around me, but I imagine they work very hard. He goes, yeah, they usually start around 5 a.m. and they'll often finish at 9 p.m. He goes, how many wealthy Mexican gardeners do you think there are? And I was like, ooh, shit, yeah, maybe this belief of hard work is not so smart. Right. And it was a great, it was like, it's like your grandpa with the right analogy at the right time that communicates emotionality. Now, if somebody logically had said to me, listen, working hard is not the best way, you need to work smart, I go, yeah, I've heard that before. But the analogy of a Mexican gardener, me visioning that, having the emotion of seeing this guy crawling out of bed with his family before his kids are even awake, going to work, working and sweating and getting all hot and really like plowing it, is doing amazing work and barely living in the process of it, coming home and his kids are asleep and working on the weekends too. Yeah, now I go, oh my God, you're absolutely right. It lands. And this is why I think that analogies and metaphors are so powerful for people to, and again, I know that your NeuroSelling and your book on storytelling drives into that. If we're going to communicate with our people, and let's just bring it right into contemporary times. So we've been riding this wave, it was all boom, and then we had COVID, and there was everybody stayed at home, and there was a freak out for all kinds of reasons. Then we came back, and there was another boom, was a bit of a bounce back from COVID. And now we've got this, we had supply chain issues and interest issues and financial issues and energy issues. And that is the potential for a recession of some kind. Be the president of our company, Jeff. Walk us through, how do we keep people engaged? How do we keep people on board? How do we keep people believing in what we're doing?
Yeah. And I think it's easy to, because our employees, they hear the noise, right? They read the news, they see all the language around the recession. And if they're not familiar enough with the market factors that impact our business or our industry, they may not be as concerned. And maybe they're more concerned than they should be in other cases. Either way, there's some level of stress in the system around what could be, and whether it's a recession or not. And so one of the things that this is a really simple tip that I'll tell folks from a cultural standpoint. I don't care whether you're having to lay people off or you're in a hiring mode or you're in growth mode or you're in stagnant mode. Once a week, at least at minimum, depending on the size of your company, do this in teams. If possible, do it in larger groups. Once a week, you should have an affirmation session when the only thing on the agenda, the only thing anyone's allowed to talk about is how they recognize somebody else in that company for doing something that led to that demonstrated the values of the company or of their values. So it's an affirmation session. And when we do this around here, and I'm telling you, there's nothing more like life-giving and not just life-giving, the energy that comes out of those sessions in productivity, in unity, and teamwork. It's silly, but we know you and I know the psychology behind it, right? Because it's people talking about the things that emotionally resonate with them as human beings. Oh, and by the way, we just happen to work here. And when we get to talk about those things at the place we work, we start to assign the belief that that place is fulfilling that whole that aligns to our ability to do that. So affirmation sessions, 30 minutes. They don't have to be 90-minute, 2-hour sessions, 30 minutes. Get your team on there and go, make it be on a calendar. It says affirmation session and everybody knows the rules. not a single thing about work. It can only be about, well, the work, it can be an affirmation about something they did at work, right? But it can only be about highlighting the success of someone else on the team. That's it. That's a great one. That'll help push through those seasons of things like recession and negative culture and all that. Go back to session 1 of our episode again as well. Having those personal vision exercises with your team, that will draw people in. It'll help them. By the way, you're going to unleash innovation. When people feel trusted, accepted, and that you see them, it unleashes innovation. And so maybe the innovation that's residing in the person on your team that will otherwise never tell you that will help you get through a recession faster because they had an idea they just would have never told you had you not spent the time to get to know their personal vision. So there's lots of things you can do and right now leaning into your employees that will help not only push you through the recession, it'll actually probably help you thrive through the recession.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. I know we're coming close to the end of part 2, and I want to just sort of talk about, because, you've done a lot on storytelling and there's a lot of stuff out there on storytelling, and it's a bit overwhelming for a lot of people, and they don't really understand what it means. In storytelling to our people, what do you think is the most important piece?
I think storytelling's become a bit cliched.
Exactly.
I think in a lot.
I want to bring it up with you because you're the expert.
Yeah, it's almost like leadership development. That's almost become cliched, right?
Yeah,
there's a lot of terms that have
generic term.
Yeah. Storytelling to me is not once upon a time there was a guy who had a podcast and he was a big leadership component and he knew neuroscience and behavioral psychology, and he had this his trademark "Stay Curious." He and Ted Lasso were kindred spirit. It isn't a storytelling like once upon a time thing. It can be storytelling. The art of storytelling, it allows you to bypass the analytical network of the brain, activates the emotional empathic system in the brain, and it elevates their ability to resonate with their own experiences. Yes. And when you can paint pictures and use visuals in your, whether it's metaphors, analogies, or stories, what happens is within seconds, the listener makes that story their own, even though it's your story. So you mentioned this earlier when I opened up episode 1 and we were talking about my Papal and I was telling you that story. I know that story sounds like on the surface that it's about me. It really isn't. It's about the listener identifying with those people in their lives that made that kind of impact on them, which then hopefully inspires them to do something greater. So as a leader, when you think about storytelling, have a plan and be purposeful with how you do it. Some people are really good at doing it off the fly, especially people that are good at talking in analogies and metaphors. They can just think one up off the fly and it really simplifies things. That's an amazing skill. But folks who don't have that intuitive skill, when they can plan the story, quote, how they want to communicate information by activating visualization, by activating emotion and tapping into the memories of their people, that's it. Because now it's back to self-discovery, right? I self-discovered how I feel about that story because my place in it. And then I learned what I can do with that. I get the point. So every story should have a point. Papal also had one of those Papalisms. We'd say, try not to make a point without a story. And you might want to tell a story that has a point. Like there was that idea that you could use stories to drive points home. That's why there's a science behind it. It's not just about storytelling. And, oh yeah, everybody knows that.
But what you just said is vital, because I think that, again, storytelling has become thrown around. It's kind of lost a lot of its depth. And, I meet people who say, oh, I'm a great storyteller. And I listen to them like, wow, hold on a second. I think you're a cure for, you may be good at stories, but only if you're looking for a cure for insomnia.
There's a lot of story reporters. I say there's a lot of story reporters. There's a difference. And the example I use is that when you know a really good communicator who uses great stories, an hour goes by and you can't even believe an hour's went by and you feel so immersed in the information. And then now juxtapose that with watching the nightly news.
Yeah.
Right. They're trying to tell stories through the nightly news. They're not. They're story reporters.
Yes.
And I think a lot of leaders and a lot of sales professionals and a lot of communicators, they report information and they think they're storytelling. When it's the arc of how to use that emotion coaster to activate that part of the brain and then make a point with it that leaves me discovering something new for myself, that's the magic.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, this has been a delicious conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, to be with and share your wonderful knowledge and insights and wisdom and your stories. They are sincerely appreciated. I want to make sure that people can find out more about you, about your books, about all the programs that you have and all the wonderful knowledge you have. Where do people find out more about you?
Yeah, if they're interested in my speaking, they can go to jeffbloomfield.com. If they're interested in learning more about our programs and a lot of the science behind it all, they can go to braintrustgrowth.com, where we have a lot of our work in our sales enablement, as well as our leadership and coaching work that we do there as well. And of course, they can find my books on Amazon, or they can hit me up on social media. Primarily, we use LinkedIn and Instagram as our primary two channels, so they can find us on there as well.
Fabulous. Well, again, it's been a pleasure and honor, sir. Thank you so much. And for you, dear listener, remember that we will have all of those links posted in the show notes. And remember that those who control the meaning for the tribe also control the movement of the tribe. Business and political leaders committed to positively shaping the political and business landscape know that we have to be able to tap into what drives human behavior. And we do that by understanding the groundbreaking understanding of the anatomy of meaning extracted from the emotional source code. I am Dov Baron. I show businesses, teams, and leaders how to harness their emotional source code to move their tribe, because unified actualized meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness in individuals and in companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Remember, we need your help. So just go over to wherever you tune into the podcast and rate, review, and subscribe to the show. It really is important. Till next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about the stories you're telling and whether they're actually stories that connect at an emotional level, or whether it's just information that most people will just walk away from. The emotional connection to another human being is best laid out in the way that they connect, not in the way that you connect. Take the time to discover what drives your people by finding out the stories they tell and then telling those stories back to them. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deepest meaning to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.